Smith-Barney. So with that, I will turn it over to Steve.
Thanks, Jenny. Thank you. Malcolm sends his apologies. Well, we can make this really quick, right? Because today I'm going to talk about trust and the economics of insecurity. So we could probably fast forward this 30 minutes. How many people trust the cybersecurity industry? Right? Who trusts the cybersecurity industry? Okay, good. All right, how many think it's very efficient from an economic standpoint? Anyone? All right, so I have one person that trusts and one person that, yeah, go.
What side of the cybersecurity, the criminal or the other?
Oh, very good point, right? It's a zero-sum game in some ways, right? Which side is the most efficient, do you think?
Criminals.
Yeah, right, criminal, and we're going to talk about that today. So thanks to Jenny for introducing me. So one of the things I like to think about is, as a profiler, when I was down at BAU, I remember talking to Ken Lanning, he's like a giant. He's like Robert Ressler or John Douglas. And I remember asking him, hey, Ken, what can you tell me about profiling? What can you tell me about human behavior? And he said one thing, and I've spoken once or twice at different things. You'll hear me say this on and on again. Ken said, there's one thing I've learned, is across all cases, whether they're serial killers, whether they're serial rape, whether they're insiders, whether they're pedophile cases, people believe what they want or need to believe in spite of all the evidence to the contrary, right? Confirmation bias. So what I want you to try to do today, and I'll tell you, the profilers are the worst ones, right? We think we don't have any bias. Absolutely. Some of the brightest ones I've met looking at serial cases are ones that just worked a serial homicide, serial killer case, and then some of the dumbest ones I've met, frankly, are the ones that just worked a serial killer case because they try to bootstrap everything to what they already know, right? And it's always going to be different. But in some context, at least, what we're going to talk about today has a lot to do with what Malcolm's presentation was. So let's tee it up. This is Mr. Steve McMillan, and he suffered from retinitis pigmentosa. It went fairly well. What he really wanted to do was watch a full moon on a clear night. So 90 days after he was actually had the surgery, his wife took him out to the backyard. He looks up into the night sky. Even though it's a clear moon, it's a clear cloudless night, full moon, he basically can't see the moon because there is an issue, I guess, with contrast initially, and it was too much contrast. Now, you and I would think that whatever AI is going on in there that he would be able to figure out, contrast would be something that would come through, but it actually wasn't the case. So he was disappointed. He turned around, and he was heading back to the house, and the lighting from inside the house actually lit up enough that he could see his wife's face in the reflection, right? So, kind of a moving, touching moment for him. And in particular, something that was really momentous. He hadn't seen his wife's face in probably a dozen years, right? So the cool thing about computing, right? The reason we're all here is computing has the power and the capability to change lives, right? But what happens to poor Mr. McMillan if we don't take care of cybersecurity, and one day he's looking at a QR code and immediately ransomware attacks who's trying to fight this battle? What is our answer to that? How are we going to do that for him? So let's start on our journey. I would say that computing, there has to be in the digital economy a strong trust factor, right? We have to trust. What is trust? I spent a couple years at the BAU where we were looking at insider threats, right? And how do you describe trust? And when a person loses trust in an organization, what does that really mean? But I think a good definition for trust or truth of something, right? And I asked that question in the beginning. Do you trust cybersecurity? Do you trust the cybersecurity industry? Here's two big factors, competence and character. right? Competence. Do they do, are they capable of doing what they say they're going to do, right? Do they get results? And intent and integrity. I don't know. I have been in this industry. I retired 2.5 years ago. I work for Cylance. I love the company. But as the industry as a whole, I don't know if I personally trust the cybersecurity industry. We'll talk about why. How many have heard this before? This was at a CISO panel. ISSA, Los Angeles, May 2017. Accept it. They are going to get in. Right? Accept it. They're going to get in. This is a victim mentality, if I have ever heard one. And it gets me really pissed off because let's change the words around. Accept it. You're going to have a serial killer kill 10 or 15 more women in your community before you catch it. Accept it. There's going to be a pedophile that's probably going to violate 20 or 25 of your children in your community before you catch them, before you're able to prevent it. Accept it. There's going to be buildings that come down every 10 to 15, 20 years because people in other parts of the world don't like the way that we do business. Accept it. Smallpox killed 300 to 500 million before it was prevented, right? But accept it. It was a way of life. So part of the problem is the victim mentality that I think the cybersecurity is putting on all of us. And the problem with victims, if we go into it, there's a problem with eventually how people think. Generally, victims think black and white. Something or nothing. They don't think in probabilities, right? They don't think about probabilities. And we're talking about risk and quantifiable risk. It's very, very important to be able to think that there's a big, big difference between an antivirus solution that can capture 45 or 50% of 0 days and one that captures 30 or 35%, right? Big, big difference. So reactive, right? That's very, very reactive in nature. I know why it exists, right? It exists to help people get through the hack, get through the attack. But from a very, very broad perspective, I think it's very short-sighted. So I do consulting solutions for Cylance. So besides having AI, one of the things I deal with is incident response, compromise assessment, red teaming, industrial control systems, security assessments, and things like that for Cylance where we try to apply our AI. So I see this mentality a lot. I see it every day. And this one, Malcolm took this picture, so I can put it in there because he was at the RSA. He's our chief security officer. He's in the C-suite. But the moment you link business risk to a security incident, that's business-driven security. And he took a picture of it, right? Now, this is the mentality that is out there. You have to experience an incident before I can attach the business risk to the incident, before I can actually have business-driven security. Again, very, very reactive, a very, very reactive mode. Today's reality, and I knew this as an FBI agent, but today's reality is we're firefighters, right? We're on the reactive end of the scale, right? We're reacting. We need to get ahead of it. We need to get way ahead of it. We need to turn the tables. We need to have the bad guy reacting to us. All right, so let's further go down this path, right? Because we all have a choice. We can continue on the way that we're doing things now, or we can turn around and try to take a different path. Today's reality, ISSA through the eyes of cyber professionals. This is us. These are the people that know a fair amount about cyber. How many of us do feel vulnerable? Well, basically, 100% of us feel vulnerable. Half of us significantly vulnerable. The other half somewhat vulnerable. Well, that's 100%, right? Vulnerability. The other thing that's very interesting, World Economic Forum risk report, income wealth disparity, climate change, all the things we see in the headlines every day, right? Things that are changing lives, aging populations. Number one risk still is cyber security risk. So we're vulnerable. We're feeling like we're really under risk. We have people giving us a victim mentality. Let's get back to trust. Trust. The Edelman report. Anybody ever hear the Edelman report? They've been around since 2002, 2003. 4 segments they have. Trust in business, trust in NGOs, trust in media, and trust in government. First time last year, all 4 segments were overwhelmed by distrust. 2/3 of us, world population, are distrusting, right? The other interesting thing about that is guess what country is rising on the trust scale? The only one. China, very good. Who said that? Outstanding, right? Yeah. Now, let's talk about messaging, right? Because messaging is extremely important in this, right? What are the messages? What are the experts? What are us? What are we telling the CISOs and the CIOs? The Internet Crime Report, right, basically is telling us that acceleration of previous trends, that's what's happening last year. APT and cybercrime boundaries are actually blending and blurring, right? And here's the one that I love, because I see this every day. The majority of attacks are neither sophisticated nor advanced, right? It's some element of wash, rinse, repeat. But what are we all worried about? And granted, there's certain of you out there, and you know who you are, you got to be really worried about the APT, right? But 99% of your day, I even heard it in a couple of the presentations so far today, 99% of your analyst days are being spent on the tier 1 alerts, right? Jamming them up. They can't hunt anymore. And the majority of attacks are really not sophisticated or advanced, right? So what's the answer? Well, let's look at where we are with regards to controls, right? Somebody out there, CISSP, system's going to say, well, let's talk about controls. This is the 9-box of controls. This was created by Malcolm, put it out in the second book. And if you look on the vertical axis, there's prevent, detect, respond. They are control types. And as I go up, I think we can all say that if I wait to respond, it's going to be very, very risky, right? Riskier than if I can prevent it from ever happening. And if I go to the right, these are control approaches, automated, semi-automated, and manual. And this is the cost. We were talking about it earlier in the other panel, which was fantastic, right? These guys jump ship. Guys, meaning guys and girls. I'm from the East Coast, we use it interchangeably. Jump ship every 8 to 12 months, right? I got to pay benefits for them, right? I got to make sure they go to school. I got to make sure they get training. They are a lot more expensive on the right end of that spectrum than they are in automated. The other axis that you see that you don't see on here is, this is really three-dimensional, as Malcolm would talk about it. There's an axis coming out at you, 3D, and it is basically friction, control friction, right? Something really frictionless is what we want. But when it's high friction, bandwidth, CPUs, the amount of work that our analysts have to do day in, day out, that's not good, right? That's not good. So controls, where are we right now? We're in manual and in response, right? Highest cost, highest risk, moving forward for poor Mr. McMillan. Where do we need to be? Well, we need to have an economic efficiency, right? We need to figure out how can we get the controls moving in the right direction? How can we spend the right money in the right spots? So, with everything I've said so far, I would say I don't think we're in an economic efficiency with how cybersecurity is working right now. What is an economic efficiency? This is where Malcolm is. He's economics undergrad, MBA finance, right? Very, very brilliant. But he has these very good basic definitions. One of them is economic efficiency. Every resource is allocated to serve pretty much in the right way, right? Applied in the right direction. Minimum waste, right? How much minimum waste do we think we are actually dealing with right now? Minimum waste or lots of waste? Where are we on the spectrum? Probably lots of waste. The ideal state is also related to the welfare that it provides the general population, right? Now, not every state is going to be able to apply the same amount of welfare, but some level of welfare, depending on the resources, has to be applied. So in cybersecurity, right? Somebody said it earlier in the panel, the difference in the Fortune 100, right, and your average, they didn't say this, your small, medium-sized business is huge. In fact, the National Cyber Alliance put out, if you didn't hear this figure, it was about a year and a half ago, they said that there's a 60% chance that a small and medium-sized business will not be in business 6 months after it's breached. 6 months, right? How's that for welfare, right, on our weakest citizens? The other thing about economic efficiency is what you probably heard of the efficient market theory, right? And the efficient market theory, when it comes to my couple years on Wall Street, is that every price, every information that might affect the price of a stock or a bond is actually built in to the marketplace, in the perfect market. The market is efficient. The grandma who just heard from her grandson that he's going to work for this fantastic company, right? The insider that we're always trying to catch that maybe got out and bought something on the sly, right? All that information is built into the efficient market theory. how efficient are our markets when it comes to what we're trying to do? Well, one of the things that we're always going to be inefficient at is the temporal advantage, right? The bad guy has the temporal advantage on us. So all that information, right, that goes into making our market efficient as to what the bad guy's going to do. The threat intelligence people are moving as hard as they can. But the bad guy's always going to have that temporal advantage. What can we do? Well, from protective work, having done a fair amount of it as a SWAT guy, as a sniper, I can tell you that bad guys hate contingencies. They hate when you feed it back into them. They hate when you're not being predictable. And one of the things that we never do is we never take advantage of the prediction that we can do looking at the bad guys, right? Bad guys are predictable on some level. They're using the same malware, right, that we talked about. They're obfuscating it, they're repackaging it, but they're using the same thing. The majority of their attacks are actually what? They're actually wash, rinse, and repeat, right? So this, when it comes to temporal advantage, we're never going to get ahead of it, but there are some things that we can possibly do. So let's look at market efficiency, and let's look at it from a financial standpoint. 74.1 correlation between breach activity and security industry revenue growth. When crap hits the fan, the security industry gets a lot of money. Right? Now you're going to say, oh, but Steve, it's innovation. Right? People are innovating. Right? A lot of money are coming in. A lot of people have great ideas as to how to solve this. Right? That's what's happening. I would like to think that. WannaCry, right? Remember WannaCry ransomware, May 2017. 5 of the biggest cybersecurity related companies at the time. So they're already there, right? It's not money coming in, seed money, innovation, new companies. Grew by a market cap rate of $5.9 billion following WannaCry. The first case I worked as an FBI agent was TW-800. Right? Remember TW-800 blew off the coast of Long Island? I was a former fighter pilot, so I found myself investigating the missile theory. We could talk about that all day. But one of the things that's very unique, or not unique, or not surprising, was if you remember, what happened to TW-800 after the plane blew up? Very shortly, and they had other reasons, right? Other things competing, but they actually went out of business, right? They went out of business. To me, this is like after WannaCry, right? This is like after TW-800 stock going through the roof. Right? People buying Boeing, it just doesn't make sense. There's something else going on here, right? They're paying for stuff that didn't work and didn't help them protect the ransomware. The market is not efficient. So what's the option? We're at a crossroads. Technology is unbelievable, right? It's changing people's lives. I can't keep up with my 3rd grader because of all the stuff that's happening to him, right, with regards to Google, and he's got an iPad, and all the teaching that's going on, blockchain, health. We talked about health earlier, right? People wearing sensors, being able to help with healthcare. We're at a crossroads. We've got to figure out a better way to do it. We have to. So this is the first way. Controls, let's put our CISSP hats on. We got to push this chart down to automation, right? Down to prevent and left to automation. We've got to do it. We can't stay out here. We already have, what, 8 million jobs that are being required? And the woman that talked about jobs, we could have a discussion about that because I think it's I feel for you having to do that. But whether there's 8 million, 3 million, or 1 million, we need more people doing this stuff, but we got to get rid of the tier 1 stuff. We got to push this to automate it, and we got to go to prevent. Forget the response and detect, at least from a focus standpoint. Now, we're always going to have to be there, right? I do IR. I do containment all the time, every day, day in, day out. We got to do that. I hope one day I'm like the Maytag repairman, right? For those old enough to remember that commercial, I remember it, right? Where I'm just sitting there waiting for something to happen because the stuff is so good that everybody's selling, nobody's getting hacked, right? That's what I'm looking for. But from a control standpoint, we got to move left, we got to move down, and we got to push in. Remember, out, I said, is friction. Right? A lot of friction. We got to be frictionless. We got to make it not very problematic for the systems. Low CPOs, low bandwidth, not putting all our stuff into the cloud from a privacy perspective. So, besides controls, I'm going to try to give you a couple ideas as to how you frame this discussion when you go back, or with your clients, or when you go back and talking to your C-suite. Business speed versus control. Which one should we try to use? Because we heard earlier, and it's true, we got to be agile, right? We got to be fast. How do we do this? Let's look at history. Let's get out of cybersecurity. The 1971 Ford Pinto, right? Lee Iacocca making a run at Volkswagen. 1968, prediction was they're going to sell 12.5 million of them. Very, very quick to market. Also, the price was, anybody remember how much, what was the goal? $2,000, not a penny over $2,000. But what happened? They failed to include an $11 part that would have stopped the fuel tanks from exploding. Now, what happened is there was a bolt. If you hit at a very, very slow speed, 20, 25 miles an hour, maybe slower in some cases, the bolt would go through the fuel tank. It would leak. And then usually in a crash, you get sparks, you get other things going on, and it would catch on fire. But why did they decide not to do the $11 part? Speed, right? They're trying to be fast. They're trying to get to market. They also did a bad calculus where they figured we're probably going to lose 180 people in 1971, 72, 73, when the Pinto memo came out. They said, well, 49 million people, $49 million is what it's probably going to cost us in liability insurance, and $11 times 12.5 million is 137 million. We're going to take the business risk. There's a famous memo called the Pinto memo. Google it. You can take a look at it. So they were missing what? Shareholder risk, and they're also missing risk to the population. A better thought, instead of speed, I'll go back to my pilot days, is velocity, right? It's speed and control. Speed is just a quantitative number, 50 miles an hour. But 50 miles an hour east, 50 miles an hour west, 50 miles an hour in a particular direction is where we need to go. Second lesson. You haven't heard of this. 1911, South Pole Expedition. 2 explorers, Raoul Amundsen and Robert Scott, set off to be the first people to actually discover the South Pole. Now, the smart money at the time was actually on Robert Scott, better funded. The dumb money, supposedly, was on Amundsen. They both started out miles apart from each other, the same point in time. Now, lots of quotes up here, but here's one from him. Wait for the spring to risk men, and this is Amundsen talking. I couldn't consider, if we are to win the game, the pieces must be moved properly. He's talking about business velocity, right? Not in a dollar exchange kind of a standpoint, but from speed, measured speed. And what happened was Amundsen ended up winning. How did he do it? Well, if you don't know this story, Amundsen set out, and every day, whether the weather was good or bad, they did 20 miles. When the weather was good, they could have gone beyond 20, but they didn't go beyond 20. He didn't want to burn his people out. They stopped at 20. When the weather was bad, going was tough. No matter how bad the weather was, they cut off 20 miles that day, right? Now, Scott, on the other hand, completely different strategy. Every day, they're going as far as they can. Good days, they're going far greater than 20. Bad days, there's probably a day in there that they probably spent their night in their tents. We'll never know for sure because Scott never even made it back. Amundsen won. 3 weeks later, Scott showed up. They saw the flag. They were disheartened. They never made it back out. What we know about that expedition is from diaries, right, and what was written. So speed and velocity, right? Business velocity is the important thing. Here's the other thing. If you haven't read these books, behavioral research in general, there's some really good stuff and there's some really bad stuff. The worst of all, frankly, from my personal experience, is leadership. Every couple of years, there's a brand new leadership, and usually it's really not vetted very well. But if you're not familiar with Jim Collins, he's fantastic, right? Good to Great, and his latest book, not latest, I think it's been out for a while now, is Choice to be Good, or Choice to be Great, Choose to be Great, Great by Choice, that's it. Great by choice. But he has a couple different things. So he talks about this mission, Amundsen versus Scott, right? He also talks about 10Xers. Has everybody ever heard of the 10Xer, what a 10Xer is? So your best performers in your organization are your 10Xers, right? Everybody else, generally, average is 1 to 2X, right? But your best performers are 10Xers. And what Collins says is, when he studied them, the 10Xers, there were some consistencies, right? When he did his research, fanatical discipline was the first thing. 20 miles, good weather or bad weather, right? And there's actually a term now they use in business called the 20-mile hike. What's the 20-mile hike for your business, right? It's one of the thoughts he has. The other thing, productive paranoia, right? My wife says I'm paranoid, but I always say a healthy bit of paranoia is good. Empirical creativity. So it's creativity and innovation when it's merited, right? When it's supposed to be there. Not just innovation for innovation's sake. And then the last one is my favorite one, limitless ambition. Right? You got to have limitless ambition. He does a metric, he calls it return on luck. Right? Return on luck, what does that mean? Well, you're working really hard. Luck is going to happen eventually, and you're prepared to take advantage of it, is what he's saying. But probably the biggest thing to walk away from, to go with our business velocity, thinking about changing the paradigm, is different behaviors, not different circumstances, generally dictate success. Different behaviors. Right? So we in the cybersecurity industry, just like Amundsen, his behavior was 20 miles. Us in the cybersecurity industry, we can't talk our way out of, Malcolm likes to say, you can't talk your way out of a situation that you behaved your way into. Right? I'm going to use that one with my kids, right? With my kid. You can't do that. So behaviors have to get us out of this situation. Behaviors trump circumstances. Finally, and then we'll wrap it up, Panama. Right? Panama Canal, probably one of the biggest things that happened to spread economic efficiency in the beginning of the 20th century. If you remember how it began, 1879, the French, hope nobody's French in here, love Paris, great place, right? But 1879, the French started building the Panama Canal. They tried for 20 years and were unsuccessful. Now, they had some things working against them. One is torrential rains, averaging 200 inches. If anybody live in Northern Virginia, you think we've had a hell year, right? Normally we get 40 inches. Any idea how much rain we've had this year? 60 inches. They actually protect this number like it's TS or something, but about 60 inches of rain we've had. Can you imagine 3 times the rain? The other problem was architecture. French had built the Suez Canal in the desert, right? Sea level, worked fine, not when you're getting 200 inches, right, a year. So that was a big thing. But the second thing was malaria. 1 out of every 6 workers were sick at any one time, right? Very, very difficult situation. The other thing is they applied a control to the symptoms, a reactive control to the symptoms. Quinine was used to try to treat the workers. Now, the problem with quinine, for you gin and tonic drinkers, right, there's a little bit of quinine in the tonic. But the problem with quinine is it leaves you deaf, right? You can't hear. So even if they survived malaria, when they got back into the battle, right, building this thing, they couldn't hear each other. They couldn't talk. They couldn't understand. Dangerous scenario to be around, right, trying to build a canal, right? So it was very, very difficult to do. So how did they solve this? Well, the U.S. comes in, right? The U.S. comes in. 1903, Panama declares itself a country. 1904, U.S. Congress officially created the Panama Canal Zone. 1909, work began again. What was going on in those 5 years? And then it was done in 1914. So what did they do? Well, Major Ronald Ross discovered that malaria was actually transmitted by mosquitoes. And to control malaria was going to be vital for the Panama Canal. So what did he do? We all know this. I pay mosquito squad, right, $1,000 a year to spray my lawn. But if I don't go out in the backyard and empty the water out of the trash cans, out of the Frisbee that's in the back, they're just going to breed anyway. So he controlled the breeding, got rid of all the irrigation that wasn't draining, fumigating, mosquito nets. They hired this guy, Colonel Gorgeous. Should have went in the Navy. He was actually in the Army. He could have been Captain Gorgeous, right? Can you imagine? He could have been Captain Gorgeous. But Colonel Gorgeous, along with others in 1904, he formed the Sanitary Department for the Canal Zone. So for the next 5 years, they provide a preventative measure, right? They looked at prevention, applying the right control to prevent. They eradicated actually yellow fever, additionally, which was a problem down there. And they actually dropped by 10-fold the number of workers that were dying, and by an 8-fold the number in the population, right, that were dying, by applying a preventative measure. construction of the Panama Canal happened, right, and fostered, nobody had to go around the Cape anymore. The economic efficiency, why? Because they applied a preventative measure in a very, very important way. Malaria wasn't eliminated, right? We're not going to eliminate the bad guys. We're not going to eliminate the threat actors. It's not going to happen, right? There's too many of them out there. But once the source was identified, ground source was identified, they could provide the right preventive control. The greatest danger for most of us is not that we aim too high, is miss, is we aim too low and that we reach it. Michelangelo, right? Famous quote. What is unlimited or limitless ambition? Is it preventative? I think it is. It's tough, right? Trying to prevent. But we got to get our mindset away from being reactive in response. Great agent I knew, believe it or not, one of his favorite sayings was fight the power, right? He was an FBI agent, right? But for 20 years, that's what all we would say. So fight the power, right? Fight the power that is we have to have an incident before we're going to do anything. We have to be able to respond. We need a patient at zero. Fight this power for sure. Don't become a victim, right? Don't give in to that victim mentality. Just change the words around. If this was something physical, would you be happy with that, right? And then Madeleine Albright, final quote from her, where our interests are clear and our values are at stake, we can make a difference. We must act, and we must lead, right? We have to do it. Hopefully you'll follow the path of prevention. Doesn't mean ignore detection and response. Thank you. Are there any questions? I tried to go as quick as I can. I really appreciate it. Any questions?
Thank you, John. We'll take the questions to the cocktail hour where I suspect no one will have a gin and tonic. Next, we have John Moran, who you gave a nice segue. We'll be talking about overcoming security automation roadblocks. So a great tie-in. John Moran is an expert in security operations, incident response, digital forensics, and investigations. He previously served as a senior incident response analyst for NTT Security, a computer forensic analyst for Maine State Police Computer Crimes Unit, and a computer forensics task force operator for the U.S. Department of Homeland Security, and he has like a dozen certifications with lots and lots of letters. But in the interest of time, I'm going to let him just come and talk to you. So come tell us how to automate.
All right, I know it's late in the day, so I appreciate everybody sticking around. I've even got my little stopwatch up here, so I'm going to start the time. I'm going to try to shave a little bit of time off here, but I appreciate you guys sticking around. What I want to talk about today, we've talked a lot about automation and the ways we can do it, some of the technologies that are used, things like that. Once we actually get into looking at implementing automation, right, it's a fairly new thing, and with a lot of new things, there can be a lot of myths, and it takes a little while for best practices to be developed. So I wanted to come out and share today some of the myths that we see commonly in the security orchestration, automation, and response industry, and some of the best practices that have started to emerge when you start looking at actually implementing these. That's about me. There's my picture. We'll move on. The reality is that myths obscure reality. And that's not just an orchestration and automation problem. That's with any new technology. When we start looking at successfully implementing some of these technologies, a lot of times these myths can give us unrealistic expectations of where we're going to end up. What am I going to get out of automation, right? Well, if you come in believing all of these myths, thinking you're going to get something that you're not going to get, you're just setting yourself up for disappointment. So I want to talk about some of those today. The first myth that we see very commonly is that automation means fewer jobs, right? We're going to take these things, we're going to automate processes, and we're going to get rid of our analysts. We don't need analysts anymore. We can automate it, right? Alexa, go ahead and take care of that data breach, right? And should be almost done by now. Maybe we'll get there someday, but we're not there. Flip that around. Automation means fewer jobs from a management perspective. Automation means I can save money and get rid of people, right? That's also probably not a realistic expectation. The reality is that we're already understaffed. We're already inundated with alerts. Automation isn't a way to to replace analysts. Automation should be used as a supplement to an analyst or a force multiplier to an analyst, right? We talked about earlier in the day when Sneal was here talking about the matrix that he had developed. You know, SOAR, right? We're in the response category, okay? Now, as we noticed, as you get further down, you're relying more on people and not technology, right? Well, okay, here I am from a security orchestration vendor saying we should be relying on people, not technology. I'm not going to come up here and disagree with Sneal. I would 100% agree with that. Automation should be a force multiplier. Automation should supplement and support your people, not replace them. If you go into it thinking you're going to be able to replace your security staff, you're going to set up for failure and disappointment, both from your expectations and the expectations of your staff when they think that they're all going to get fired and replaced by Alexa. Another myth we see, security is too complex to automate, right? I mean, you know, we're protecting tens of thousands of endpoints. We've got, you know, secret data all over the place. We can't possibly automate this. It's too complex, right? Well, sure. You know, if you look at automating everything in your security environment, we're going to automate every single process. That's probably not a realistic expectation. But the fact that security is just too complex to automate altogether, I think we can all agree is a bit of a myth. So how do you choose what to automate? We'll start with the small, manageable bits, right? We want to look at items that are going to show value in automation, especially when we're looking at getting management on board, when we're looking at rolling out these first automation processes. Things that are going to show value. Test and validate your ideas. Show that this automation thing can work, right? And then move on to the bigger and better things once you've fine-tuned some of those smaller, manageable bits. Another myth, automation is dangerous, right? We can't automate security because it's too unpredictable. We don't know what's going to happen, so how can we automate that? How can we decide how we're going to respond to every single security incident? Well, okay, here's an example workflow. This is our security process here. If we go into it and we say we're going to automate everything, all of these processes, we're going to automate them, right? Is that dangerous? Sure, yeah, that may be a bad idea. That may be a bad expectation to set. If you find something that can truly automate your entire security process from end to end with no human intervention, and it is just that Alexa scenario, that's an automation unicorn. Never been seen before. Take a picture, capture it, document it. We'd like to study it, okay? That's not a realistic expectation. But what we can do, like we talked about before, is those small, manageable bites. So pick out those things that are documented, are repeatable, that we can predict, that we can execute in a common way, and start to automate those little bits. And it makes automation not dangerous, but again, it makes it that enabler, that enhancement for your security program, that force multiplier that allows your security team to focus on the things that we can't automate, the things that may be dangerous to automate, right? I don't want to accidentally block my domain controller, take a critical web application offline. There's always going to be places where automation can be maybe not the best way. And as a vendor, we talk about kind of supervised automation and putting in sort of human intervention and putting in some decision points where humans can make decisions, right? That kind of reduces some of that danger. But the point is, automation is not dangerous. Security is not too complex to automate. We just need to approach it in an intelligent and safe, thought-out manner, right? So let's talk about some best practices here real quick. Obviously, we know, like in anything, best practices, best results. So we want to have measurable goals in mind when we look at automation, right? You know, you were talking earlier about, you know, how our mindset is just kind of throw more tools at it, right? Especially the cool new stuff, right? Security orchestration, automation, and response. Everybody wants to do it now. Automation is the next big thing. It's going to save the industry, right? So we're just going to go, okay, great. Everybody's telling me I should have automation. Let's do automation. What are you trying to solve? What do you want to do with that automation? What are your goals, right? So we want to look at doing things like we talked about automating the repetitive, mundane tasks, All right, maybe your goals are to decrease the time to respond to an incident. Maybe you're short-staffed and you want that force multiplier for your security teams. Maybe your biggest challenge is being able to respond in a documented, repeatable manner, right? Or maybe you're just looking to reduce overall risk. Maybe it's a compliance thing. But know what your goals are. Don't just automate because, hey, we want to automate and it's the new thing. Have goals in mind. Have a measure of success before you start jumping into automation. And that helps you, obviously as a vendor, right? That helps us, trying to kind of help you develop a solution. But it also helps you evaluate vendors, right? You're looking at everybody does automation and orchestration now, right? How do you know what solution is right for you? Well, what are your goals? What are you trying to accomplish? Because one vendor may do that better than another vendor. Identify the processes you want to automate, right? We talked about finding those repeatable processes, those things that are safe to automate, those small manageable bites that we can take into the automation world, right? So we want to look at things like, which tools can be easily automated? What processes are consistent? What processes are predictable, right? What do we have in our environment that we're doing over and over and over again that's taking our analysts' time that we can automate and use that to show value in our processes? We talked about what's repetitive. What processes don't require much human intervention, right? We see a lot of automation in the data enrichment space. Do I really need a human to go out and look up 15, 20, 100 IPs on VirusTotal, right? Is that a valuable use of their time? Probably not. We can automate those things very easily. There's very little human intervention. And what's taking too much time? Again, going back to that, doing your data enrichment, right? Why am I paying somebody for an hour to go out and query these IP addresses and correlate that data, right? There's things that can do that. It's not a valuable use of your time. So getting started, we talked about finding those small, easy to automate processes. We want to look at those well-documented, well-understood processes, right? Hopefully in your organizations, you have some sort of security processes that are documented somewhere, I hope. Look at those ones that are well understood and start codifying those and automating those in some sort of an automation solution. Look for things that are quick and easy to show value, right? Some of you in here, maybe in the C-suite and you're looking for that immediate value. Some of you may be trying to push automation to your managers or to your C-suite. Either way, you want those things that are going to show immediate value so that you can continue with the orchestration. Right? Look at how great this is. Look at how great automation is. Let's automate all the things, okay? And then build out from there. Once you've shown that value, once you've proved to the organization these things work, once you've proved to yourselves and your security teams these things work, you can build out from there and keep going. Remember, humans are not the enemy to automation. This is not it's not a competition. It's not a battle of man versus machine here. We don't want to remove humans from the process. That is so critical to the success of automation. It's not getting rid of people, it's enabling your workforce, enabling your security analysts with the automation, complementing each other, and allowing that human interaction, that sort of supervised automation when it's appropriate, especially when you start to look at things like doing containment or banning or blocking. Right? Those are good times for human interactions or those kind of critical junctions that we want to be able to still empower our analysts to do. So real quick, I'll zip through these. We'll save a few minutes for questions and then hopefully pick up some time here. But I'd just like to talk about some common use cases just to get you thinking about automation and where the sort of most common ways that we see people starting out in automation, where we see people starting to quickly show value in automation. So common threats that we face every day, right? Phishing emails. How many phishing emails do we get? And we talk about being able to block those but great, some still get through. How do we deal with those? Well, we can very easily automate things like pulling out embedded links, looking at IP addresses, looking at the sender emails. That's all manual analysis that some poor, tier 1 analyst is being paid to do. We can automate all of those things, right? All the email attachments, pull those right out, scan them. All of that information, we're not making decisions at this point in an automated manner, but you're saving the time that all those analysts would have spent doing that, and you're just presenting the information. A lot of times through automation, this information is already available before they're even aware that the alert exists or before it pops up in the queue. We can then start doing things like actually going through quarantining the email, right? Deleting that from the user inbox, notifying users, checking for other instances of that particular phishing email, right? If one employee in your 10,000 person organization got it, maybe 10 others did and didn't report it, right? All of that stuff is the kind of stuff that we can start to automate to save our analysts time. Looking at proxy alerts, so IDSs, proxies, IPSs, whatever you want to call it, your network detection technologies. Again, we're looking at things like querying threat data, right? Bring that information all in for the analyst, saving the analyst that time. So domain information, getting your DNS records, geolocations, right? Even more advanced things. You have a sandbox in your environment, throw your sandbox against that URL. All that stuff comes right back and is available for the analyst. And then, depending on your level of comfort, blocking a domain, perhaps blocking an IP address, or at least allowing your analyst the option to come in and just with one click say, yep, go ahead and block that, and then allowing the automation to continue on and actually block that for you in whatever network devices you have available. IDS alert, fairly similar example. We'll skip over that one for time. So that's it. So that's all I have. So what I really wanted you guys to take away from this, and I know I zipped through it, but all these will be, the slides will be available online. I'm certainly happy to talk with people afterwards. But just to get you thinking about where automation can actually benefit you and your environment. Where can I actually take all these great ideas we're talking about, how we can automate things, how can I actually put that into practice and do so in a way that is, sets realistic goals and expectations. With that, I know, like I said, I rushed right through it. A few minutes for any questions. Yep.
I have heard repeatedly about automation removing jobs, but are there studies that support that it doesn't do that, that we actually see a different level of job engagement from the employees that are involved with that? Because I think that's one of those myths that we're having a hard time unseating.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think there's any specific studies that have ever been done on that. And, unfortunately, automation, when it's implemented incorrectly, can be used. I mean, there's nothing to prevent me as a CISO from saying, I'm going to cut 5 people and automate those tasks, right? There's nothing to prevent that from happening, and unfortunately, sometimes it does happen, and that's one of the reasons that I talk about it, because it's setting yourself up for failure. It's not doing your organization any good to cut those people and try to replace them with a machine, right? We're just not at that point. But anecdotally, I can tell you that from a lot of our customers, they've achieved much better results by using that automation as that force multiplier, as that enabler. It starts to free up their time, right? Analysts are, we all know, that important alerts are probably getting skipped over. We're ignoring things that need to be dealt with. And even if you're one of the lucky few that's not under that time crunch, now it frees up your analysts to do more advanced things, to get out and do some proactive hunting. You're not always playing catch up. You're freeing up some of that time that your analysts are spending by automating some of those repeatable tasks and allowing them to be more proactive and going out and looking for threats in the environment. Any other questions? Breeze through that in just about 20 minutes. That much closer to drinks. Exactly.
Thank you very much, John. And last but not least, I think anybody who works in the identity space probably already knows Jeremy Grant or knows of Jeremy Grant. So talking about Better Identity America, Jeremy Grant serves as Venable's Managing Director of Technology Business Strategy and is a member of the firm's e-commerce, privacy, and cybersecurity group. He also leads the Better Identity Coalition, which we're a member of, doing some really interesting work. Previously, before returning to private sector, he established and led the National Program Office for the National Strategy for Trusted Identities in Cyberspace, or the NSTIC, housed over at NIST, and that was the first new cybersecurity program launched by the administration running activities across public and private sectors to drive a marketplace for more secure, privacy-enhancing identity solutions for online services. Obviously a topic of passion for him in public and private sector. So without further ado, Jeremy, why don't you tell us what's coming next in this space?
It's good to move around. I threw up my back yesterday, so if I'm sitting or standing too much in one place, bad things can happen. So thanks for the invitation. Thanks, Jenny, for the introduction. I saw her holding my giant bio, I think printed off our firm's website, and I said, please don't read that. Every time somebody reads my bio, I realize it should be much shorter. But then the firm says you should have a lot of things to say. Somebody wants to read it. Anyways, thanks. So I'm here today to talk about some interesting work that we have been pulling together with US Bank and a bunch of other firms from different sectors over the last nearly year now, focused on the intersection of identity and cybersecurity and looking at where some of the threats are, as well as what we call a policy blueprint for what we think should happen here in the US next. So as background, the coalition was formally launched in February, although started to come together, I guess, late last year after the Equifax breach. The focus is companies that are coming together, working to develop and advance consensus-driven cross-sector policy solutions that can promote the development and adoption of better solutions for identity and authentication. We launched, as I said, in February 2018. It's an initiative of a broader nonprofit called the Center for Cybersecurity Policy and Law. And our goal is that as government is contemplating new ideas to improve the quality of digital identity, improve the way that identity can actually be something that's a strength when we look at cybersecurity risk management rather than a weakness right now, where I think the latest Verizon data breach report said 81% of breaches were tied to identity, mostly compromised passwords. The coalition's working together to focus not just on the security side, but also how do we come up with solutions that can also improve privacy and convenience for all Americans. So a little bit of background in terms of what drove some of this. Little breach that happened just about a year ago started to get quite a bit of attention when Equifax revealed, among other things, 145 million Social Security numbers in nearly half the countries was compromised. But one of the things that started to be, I guess, a real issue that some policymakers started to focus on underneath that was that Equifax is one of several major providers of what people call knowledge-based authentication or knowledge-based verification. You guys have all been through this. I imagine you apply for a loan online and they ask you, what street did you live on in 2003? You took out a car loan 3 years ago. Who was the bank that gave it to you? The idea behind it is these are out-of-wallet questions that if somebody found your wallet on the street, they wouldn't be able to actually know the answers. But when one of the major providers of this service then gets breached, it starts to raise some real questions about how valid is this as a solution going forward. And by the way, we'd seen some problems with this in the past. In 2015, when the IRS was breached, they found 700,000 accounts were basically slashed through because the attackers, most of whom they think came from China, already knew the answers thanks to other breaches that they had aggregated. So in the wake of this, and particularly the focus on all of these Social Security numbers being stolen, there were a couple of interesting announcements that came out. In fact, we're sitting here on October 3rd today, so I guess this is the anniversary of it. Rob Joyce, who was the president's cybersecurity advisor back when the president had a formal cybersecurity advisor, came out the same day as the former CEO of Equifax and said, we need to replace the Social Security number. Patrick McHenry, who's, I think, the fourth-ranking Republican in the House of Representatives, proposed legislation that would ban any of the credit bureaus from using the SSN for any purpose, which, as far as I could tell, would probably grind the economy to a halt in 48 hours if it was implemented, because nobody could be able to get credit the way that the systems work today. So one of the questions that came up was, these might not be where we want to focus, but there's a lot that we actually could do. Would there be benefit in bringing together an organization of leading firms from different sectors that would actually work cross-sector to develop this set of consensus policy recommendations, this policy blueprint? So our members include several major banks, including US Bank, who's been one of the founding members, Quicken Loans, who actually just joined recently, the largest originator of mortgages in the US, payment firms like Discover, MasterCard, and Visa, fintech firms like Onfido and Kabbage, Aetna on the health insurance side, their chief security officer, Jim Routh, has been heavily focused on identity and security, and some vendors in the space, including most recently Equifax, who, after being the reason this group was formed, read our recommendations and said, it's actually pretty good. We think we'd like to help be part of the solution. So what we're really focusing on here, let me take a step back now that I've talked about the coalition. Why are we actually here? So this cartoon, I think most of you are familiar with it, is now 25 years old. In fact, it turned 25 on July 3rd, which means in dog years, both the dogs in this are now 175 years old, which means they're dead, and several of their descendants are dead. But the problem that they first described here is as pervasive as ever. In fact, if anything, it's gotten worse. The fact that nobody knows you're a dog on the internet is no longer just something that's kind of cute. It's now being weaponized against us in several different forms. So when we look at the challenges we're dealing with today with digital identity, it's essential to security. How do you protect privacy? How do you deliver an excellent customer experience? How do you address compliance in regulated industries? How do you leverage identity as a way to reduce transaction costs? Because it turns out trying to figure out who's a dog can be pretty expensive. And a lot of this all wraps up into a big word, which is trust. And trust is something that's hard to get right. Also hard to push the button, apparently. But identity, when done right, can enable trust. Identity becomes the great enabler, providing the foundation for digital transactions and online experiences that are not only more secure, but also easier to use and that can protect privacy. The challenge, and the reason we're still dealing with this 175-year-old dog cartoon now, and my old agency, NIST, actually did a nice job describing what we're up against, is that digital identity presents a real technical challenge. It always involves proofing individuals, trying to figure out if you are who you say you are, over an open network, and always involves the authentication of individual subjects over an open network. So the processes and technologies that we are using to establish and use digital identity offer multiple opportunities for impersonation and attacks. And this has really been our approach to date. I feel like most of you have dealt with security questions as a backup to your password, which has really proven to be really practical, particularly if you are sometimes like me and you can't remember what the answer was. United Airlines asked me, what's my favorite sea animal? By the way, that was one that they pre-chose for me, the question. I had to find a favorite sea animal, and sometimes I forget, and it's, then I'm cast off into the abyss. And, we have increasing challenges when some of these secret questions are something where adversaries already know the answer. Passwords haven't worked particularly well for us. I'm sure all of you have had the joy of leveraging or going through the experience of different companies or internet sites' password policies. Nobody can actually manage these criteria for one password, let alone 20 or 30 or 60 or 100. Any password that meets this criteria isn't actually secure. There's really no such thing as a secure password these days because most of the attacks on passwords don't come from people trying to brute force them. That's really passé. It's through phishing. They trick you to click on an email, and then you give up your secret. And if you have a 64-character password, that doesn't really slow things down, other than you probably will fat finger it and not type it incorrectly. And quite importantly, when you put these kinds of policies in place, it makes your employees and your customers hate you. So the cost of our outdated identity solutions is actually pretty significant. There were 16.7 million victims of identity fraud in 2017. That's pretty significantly up from where we've been in previous years. Nearly $17 billion was stolen as a result of identity fraud. We saw a 44% increase in the number of U.S. data breaches from 2016 to 2017, 179 million records stolen, which was a 389% increase over 2016. And 69% of our incidents were identity theft incidents. And I won't read everything in here other than to say we've got some numbers that show we've got a bit of a problem. Why has this been so hard to solve over these years? Why is the dog now 175 years old in dog years, and yet all of the smartest people in the world who've been working on this, and a few not so smart ones maybe, have been unable to solve it? The challenge is what we talk about in our report as the identity gap, which is, and often when we get into these discussions, the question is, well, don't we need a national ID? Won't that solve things? And the answer is we're not going to get one, and no, it won't solve the problem. The issue is not that we need a new identity system. We have a number of nationally recognized authoritative identity systems here in the US, the driver's license, the passport, the social security number, my global entry card, among other things. The problem is that every one of them is trapped in the paper world. There's no way to actually use them in an easy fashion online. So, as a result, industry has tried to come up with some innovative ways to get around this identity gap. When you got these questions, like which of the four following banks give you a loan in 2013, it might have not been a great experience, but industry needed to do something to enable trusted digital commerce, and this was basically the best thing that was out there. It worked for a while until the attackers got wise to it and figured out ways around it, and now it doesn't. Now we need to move on to something better. But figuring out what that is, that's actually a pretty hard question to answer. The attackers have caught up. The out-of-all-the questions aren't as secret as they used to be. So this was actually, I think the issue we're dealing with here was really nicely tackled by Congressman Greg Walden in a hearing that the House Energy and Commerce Committee, which he chairs, held just after Thanksgiving last year, looking at this topic. And it was looking at Equifax, but it was looking at the broader impact on the way we handle identity and security online. And he drew attention to a topic that I think really is worth noting, which is pointing out, he said, look, we've had a lot of big breaches over the years. While any one of them on its own creates some pretty serious issues, what we're now seeing is that malicious actors are combining multiple stolen data sets. They're taking all the stuff that they have and putting it together, and they're running analytics on it. Now they got it into one, and they're then able to obtain more complete packages of identity information, which they can generally use to then breach through the next system that's using knowledge-based questions and execute even more harmful attacks. So things have really gotten to a point where the way we've been doing things isn't sustainable anymore. Social security numbers are certainly no longer secrets, not when you go on the dark web and get what most Americans' numbers are for 99 cents or less. So in summary, where we're at today, in an era where transactions are increasingly digital, our authoritative identity systems are stuck in the paper world. Our solutions that papered over these, such as the KBA quizzes, helped for a while, but the attackers have caught up. Shared secrets, like social security numbers, which we pretended were secret, said they're really not, or passwords aren't really any longer secret. We're able to get through them, or attackers can get through them pretty quickly. The good news is amidst all this negativity, there is a lot of industry innovation that's ongoing to try and develop better next-generation identity solutions like passwordless authentication now being built into devices through things like the FIDO standards, and identity proofing tools that can scan and validate identity documents from a smartphone, maybe even throw in a selfie picture that they'll use face recognition to match against a license. These are all great tools. But at the end of the day, government, at least here in the US, is the one authoritative issuer of identity. And so in the next phase of making identity better, the government's going to have an essential role to play. So what does better look like? We spent a lot of time talking about this as we were creating this blueprint over the last few months. And we really seized on four things. One is better security with less fraud and identity theft. I've already talked about some of the problems in the space. It's worth noting that in 2016, a bipartisan commission that the White House had put together to make recommendations for the incoming administration flagged what a problem identity is in cyberspace and said, this is big enough that we should set a goal, which is by 2021, we don't have major attacks where identity is the attack vector. Of course, that might mean we still have a lot of major attacks and things go on to something, people go on to something else. But the idea was when you're looking at how it's basically an anomaly these days, when you have a breach and identity is not an attack vector, that's a national priority. But it's not just about security, it also means better convenience for consumers, allowing consumers to open accounts online with ease without having to go through duplicative, burdensome enrollment processes. This in turn can generate better confidence for both consumers and service providers that the identities they're asserting online are reliable and trustworthy. And we think better privacy has to be an important part of the equation, really upfront. Shifting the predominant model for identity verification, where one that's based on firms aggregating your personal data without your consent, or even knowledge of it in many cases, to one where consumers are proactively requesting that parties that they already have a relationship with are able to validate their identity for other parties online. So, as I mentioned, our 5-point plan that we published in July in an event up on Capitol Hill, we called it a policy blueprint, and it really is designed as such. It lays out 5 core areas where government can and should help, a specific action plan detailing who should do what in both Congress and the executive branch. We also flag in the report that there isn't any one single initiative that can solve identity, and we also point out that there are problems that are out there that this won't address. We tried to focus on things that weren't moonshots, but things that could be done in the next 2 to 4 years that, if implemented, would make a material difference in terms of the way that firms like U.S. Bank and, frankly, every company and every person in this room are able to manage and address identity online. But our point was that if we take this as a package and fund it, it can start to make things better. So 5 key initiatives that are in there, and I'm going to really focus quite a bit on the first 2 today because I think they're worth getting into. First, we need to prioritize the development of next-generation remote identity proofing and verification systems. That means getting beyond these quizzes that we've been dealing with or other things that just don't work that attackers have cut through and getting to something that's a little bit more effective and involves the government playing a role as well. Second was looking to start to change the way America uses the Social Security number, given all of the attention that it's been getting after recent breaches and calls for something different. Third is to promote and prioritize the use of strong authentication. There's been a lot of great work going on here, particularly with industry, in many cases working with government through standards organizations to come up with next generation standards now being embedded in devices and operating systems and browsers. Here we don't think the government needs to do much at all other than do whatever they can to keep their foot on the gas with industry in terms of pushing them to keep making progress in this area. We think international coordination and harmonization is here. Most of our members operate globally. The economy is global. Taking a U.S.-only approach that is going to be somehow at odds with what the rest of the world is doing isn't going to be necessarily helpful in the long run. And finally, we think that government needs to work with industry to educate both consumers and businesses about better identity, what these new solutions are, and how people can actually start to take advantage of them and deploy them. So let me start with the first one. Developing next-generation remote identity proofing and verification systems. So the easiest way to describe this is to tell a story, which Jenny's heard a couple times, but most of you haven't, so hopefully she'll indulge me, which is, I've lived in Washington, D.C. since 1996, but about 2 years ago, thanks to the REAL ID Act, which was federal legislation that was passed in 2005 that created a federal standard across all the state DMVs for issuance of a driver's license, including a pretty robust in-person proofing process, I had to make the lovely journey down to the DMV to get my first REAL ID driver's license, because they had to bring me in to prove it was still me. They weren't really sure if it was me before the first time. And it was a pretty rigorous process. I had to show up in front of a government official with my old license. I brought my passport, I brought my social security card, I brought my birth certificate, I brought 2 pay stubs, I brought 2 utility bills. This is about as robust a process as anybody's going to go through in their life. And at the end, all I got for it was a new plastic card that had a couple shiny things that weren't on the last plastic card, but all the information was the same. And I kind of shrugged and said, well, that was interesting. So 5 months later, I guess this was February of 2017, my wife and I decided we wanted to take out a home equity line on our house so we could finish our basement. I got 2 little kids, now 10 and 7, so I guess they were 9 and 6 at the time. They're a little wild and noisy. We figured if we could throw them in the basement, this would be an improvement to the quality of our life. We even spent a little money to put some sound insulation in there so we can't really hear them, which is great now and will be terrifying when they're teenagers. But anyways, back to the story. I went online because I figured it's 2017, everything's digital. I'm going to go online and I'm going to, apply for this loan, and I'm going to be able to, just take out the money and we'll get going. And I went on, found the product I wanted, typed in all my information, and at the end, a little thing popped up that said, "That's wonderful, Mr. Grant. Everything's filled out in your application. It's all in order. Now, can you please find some time to go over to your nearest bank branch and walk in and hand them this plastic card that's in your pocket so they can look at it and look at you and say, okay, now we know it's you to go forward." And the answer is, I could do that, and that's what I had to do. But the real question I had was, this is kind of dumb. Why can't I instead go back to my DMV and say, yoo-hoo, you guys remember me? You should, because you just put me through a really rigorous process 5 months ago. Here's me. I'm actually logging in with, in this case, I use my YubiKey, giving cryptographic proof of possession. It's a little USB token that I carry in my pocket for other accounts online to lock down. So here, it's proof that it's me. Could you please tell this bank 7 things about me so we can get on with this transaction? And the answer to why I can't do that is not a technology issue. We've got all the technology we need today to make that happen. But DMVs don't do that. Governments in general don't vouch for people online. Identity's stuck in the paper world. So what we really need to focus on here, if we really want to get to more secure systems, is to look to modernize America's legacy paper-based systems around a privacy-protecting, consumer-centric model that allows consumers, and we think it really has to start with the consumer making this request, to do something online, to do something digital they couldn't do otherwise because of the risk model. Allowing consumers to ask an agency that issued them a credential to stand behind it in the online world by validating the information from the credential. So here's how this could work. The paper focuses on a sample person named Stacy, who may or may not be my wife, who's looking to open an account at US Bank, definitely US Bank. And she sends all the information online, name, address, date of birth, driver's license, social security number. And I go, we don't know if it's her. So here, we would actually introduce something new, which would be the Social Security Administration, who probably can tell you at least if there's a real person with that identity or not in their system. She would say, I'd like to electronically consent, request that the government proves on me. They then pass that consent on to SSA. They pass their information on. And they don't actually share any personal information. They just give you a yes/no answer in terms of whether there's a match. And likewise, we could do this with the DMV, where again, she says, hey, DMV, could you validate some information that you guys already know about me, and send the information through, and they can say if there's a match. Now, this doesn't necessarily prove that it's Stacy at the other end of the transaction, but it does solve a really important problem called synthetic identity fraud, which is what happens when people will take a real person's social security number, usually a child who doesn't have any credit history and thus won't show up as having gone bankrupt, and then somebody else's name, and they'll basically trick the system into issuing credit, which costs banks, I think, about $6 billion a year right now. And since not everybody feels bad for banks losing money, boo-hoo, right? Wrecks the credit histories of thousands of kids every year, because I could take my 7-year-old and we run him through the system, and then he turns 18 and he realizes that he's is told the first time he applies for credit that he's got thousands of dollars worth of bad debt from half dozen accounts that were opened in his name. So this really gets to some of that. Now, of note, while we were in the middle of actually writing this paper in the springtime, Congress went and passed legislation that is actually directing the Social Security Administration to stand up this service for any new transactions that fall under the Fair Credit Reporting Act. One of the points we've made in our paper is FCRA covers a lot of account openings. It doesn't do all. From a citizen's perspective, why do I care if I'm trying to prove who I am online and want SSA to help, whether it's covered under the law or not? But we do think helping SSA get this stood up will be an important precedent in terms of showing how this can be done and that it's secure and good for privacy and quite viable. The other way this could start to work is actually starting to leverage apps on the smartphone that might be bound to government credentials to prove identity. So we'll start with Stacy again. This time she's going to the water department instead, just because we're going to mix it up a little bit. And again, she provides her information, and they say, we've got no idea who this person is. How do we figure it out? And again, she'll say, I want the government to help me prove I'm me. But at this point, she'd do something a little bit different, which is to connect with her DMV, she would actually launch a mobile driver's license app on her smartphone, which would be issued by the DMV at the time that the paper license or the plastic license is issued, and basically bound to the device, could be protected with a cryptographic key stored in a restricted operating environment, like the trust execution environment or the secure enclave in an iPhone. So she could basically leverage that key to then log into the DMV and say, here's me. You already know that I'm holding this phone now. Can you prove it's me? And then a connection could be set up between the two, share the information, and do a match. And what you get here now is if you actually bound the holder of the phone to the app at the same time that the license was issued, and then required, say, a local biometric match on board the device, leveraging something like the FIDO standards, now you know that this person is actually the person to whom the credential was issued. It gives you much stronger identity binding. So this was something I mentioned that 2016 Commission report before that was specifically called out in there, actually. There was a near-term action item the government should serve as a source to validate identity attributes to address online identity challenges. And they recommended the next administration, I think when they were writing this they weren't sure who it would be, should put together an interagency task force designed to try and find secure, user-friendly, privacy-centric ways in which agencies can serve as one authoritative source to validate identity attributes in the broader market. They also suggested focusing on states, given the role of the DMVs and what you have with the Real ID Act. So this hasn't happened yet, but we're starting to have some good conversations as a result of our blueprint, not to mention people asking questions again after Equifax, what do we do now? So I think an important question that comes up with all of these, when you start talking about the government vouching for you online and playing some sort of a role as a digital identity provider, is what about privacy? And we think it's really important to make sure privacy is architected in from the start. So up front we flag in the paper, just the lack of these good solutions has impacted the privacy of millions of Americans. 16.7 million people had their identity stolen last year, in part because of the inadequacy of the solutions we have today. So making things more secure can certainly help to improve people's privacy. But we think it's important to go further and make sure that any new solutions that are backed or supported by the government support a privacy by design approach, to make sure that any solutions architected from the start to anticipate privacy risk and address them and actually build protections into the architecture. We think it's very important that government only steps into this role to validate data if a consumer specifically, affirmatively requests it, and only for the purpose specified. We think consumers should be able to choose or share to validate only certain attributes about themselves without revealing all of their identifying data. And we think if this is really going to work, the government, my old agency, NIST, is actually going to have to step in to set a framework of standards and operating rules that will actually ensure that any new systems we're building here are secure and privacy preserving. So we talked a little bit about what I wanted the DC DMV to do today, and the fact that they don't do it. One of the reasons the DMVs don't is they're not exactly the most modern architectures when it comes to technology. So, it's great that the license is, the most commonly used document to provide identity today. It's great that we've got a robust identity proofing process that's in person. A lot of states aren't architected to support modern identity services. A lot of states are running DMVs off of infrastructure that's 20 to 30 years old. This might be one of the older ones in the picture. But, states, when you talk to them, kind of nod their head and say that's interesting, but they're not incented right now on their own to invest in DMV modernization above other priorities in the states to support digital identity. So one of the things that we call for in the paper, we did an analysis looking at a few DMV modernizations that were actually public and looking at what the cost was per citizen in states, and obviously big states, they usually spend more than small states on these things. Turns out there's $2.5 to $3 billion in unaddressed funding needs for DMV modernization in terms of the types of architectures that would support better identity. So one of the things that we noted in our paper is the federal government's going to have to help here. The states aren't going to do this on their own. It's a lot of money. The federal government shouldn't pay for everything, but they should provide some seed dollars out there. So we have called for a new 5-year grant program at $200 million a year to the states to basically provide the seed money to start to catalyze some of these modernizations and get the states moving in terms of the role that we think they're going to need to play going forward. And, in addition to providing the seed money to make something happen that's not going to happen otherwise, one point we've made as we've talked to folks on the Hill is you can't solve this for free. You're going to have to invest some dollars somewhere. This is the best place to do it. If it's federal dollars that are going to the states, you have the benefit of having some strings attached. You only get to invest in modernizations that are going to support a particular set of use cases, and they can only be used to invest in systems that are actually going to follow this framework we think NIST should be creating to address security and privacy. It also ensures a consistent approach across the states with interoperability across all 50 states rather than individual states doing their own thing on this that doesn't work for people outside of one state. We also think it's important with this, and I know, given that OASIS has pulled this conference together, to talk about how important it's going to be for both R&D and more standards work in this space. So, when we look at where we were at 5 or 6 years ago in terms of the investment in identity, R&D, and standards, investments unfortunately waned. Some programs have wrapped up that were ongoing. There are not new investments coming in. We think it'll be important for the government to develop a new forward-looking investment strategy for R&D and standards work that, one, ensures alignment and priorities across different agencies, and also ensures that the necessary work in this space is funded. In terms of focus areas, to be clear, private sector doesn't think the government should solve this. There is a lot of good private sector standards efforts underway, but the government should be an active participant in there where they have interests that need to be represented. We think it'll be also important to augment private sector-led R&D and standards to fill critical gaps in the identity space. And we think more work's needed to be done, particularly on privacy-preserving technologies and identity systems, where there's been some good research done, some little pilot programs, but we haven't gotten some of these technologies to the point that they're truly scalable, can meet commonly accepted performance standards. And taking a look at where we have gap, we've got pretty good standards for proofing and authentication and federation. When we start talking about exchanging attributes between parties and how to do it in a way that's secure and architected for privacy, how do we use new identity analytics tools that can look at different signals coming from somebody online behind the scenes and be able to increase the confidence that it's really them? How to really manage privacy and consent? How do we apply some of these privacy-preserving technologies we've talked about? There is some standards work with mobile driver's licenses, like that app that I showed you earlier, underway, but it's moving a little slow. The use cases might not be exactly where the market wants it to go. And with that, if you're going to put the driver's license bureaus at the center of this, you need to make sure that they've got best-in-class security as well. Otherwise, they become the next point of attack. So that's our summary in terms of where we think we need to focus on the identity side. I want to just take a couple minutes, and I know I'm standing between you and drinks, so I won't go too long, to also talk about the Social Security number, because some of the proposals that came out a year ago started to get attention, and they weren't necessarily the right ones. So I talked about, do we replace the SSN? Do we ban people from using it? One of the things that I observed when these proposals were first coming out was they were overlooking a really key fact, which is that in the US, the Social Security number is not one thing. So first, it's an identifier. So if you put my name into Google and you look for images of me, you'll see a whole bunch of different Jeremy Grants show up. One who doesn't even spell his name right. Jeremy Grant's a 6'8" power forward, I think for the 76ers in the NBA, but he spells his name Jerami. I don't even know why he shows up in my screen. But the one way to tell, well, aside from the fact that I'm not 6'8" and a basketball player, the one way to tell which one is me is that I have an SSN that's unique to me. And so Social Security numbers are used as an identifier to try and figure out of all the different people who might have the same name, how do you actually know which one is a particular individual? And identifiers are often public. In fact, in many cases, you want them to be public. So, my Twitter handle is @jgrant in DC. Knowing that doesn't give you the ability to hack into my Twitter account. You just know how to figure out who I am relative to the other Jeremy Grants that are out there. My email address is jagrant@venable.com. Again, it's a publicly available identifier. Social Security number, I would argue, is a publicly available identifier these days, only in that it's publicly available because it's been stolen so many times. The notion that we told people to keep it secret might have made sense for a while until we had enough breaches that it just wasn't anymore. But as an identifier, it plays a pretty important role. Where we've really gone downhill in this country over the last 25 years, well, there's a lot of things, but using the SSN as an authenticator, pretending that it's a secret, pretending that we can actually use knowledge of my full SSN or the last 4 digits of my Social Security number to validate that I'm actually me and not somebody else. So authenticators, it's pretty important that they're a secret. Passwords we've had for years, those aren't really so good anymore. These days you usually want to have multi-factor authentication that leverages a mix of things like biometrics and cryptographic keys. You can have one-time password generators as well, which used to be more secure than they are now. We're seeing attackers get sliced through them pretty easily. But the key here is it shouldn't be widely known. But we've continued to use the SSN time and time again as an authenticator, this illusion that it's still a secret and that we can somehow depend on the fact that only you would possibly know the last 4 of your Social Security number. The reality is if you call a call center and they ask you that, the only logical answer is, don't you realize that every potential attacker has already gotten this information and could be using this to get into my system? But we're a little slow to adapt there. So getting to stronger forms of authentication, getting off using the Social Security number is going to be quite important. So we think it's really important to frame proposals around the future of the SSN. When you talk about replacing it, is this an authenticator? Great. Is it an identifier? That's a lot trickier to do. We should stop using it as an authenticator. The reality is we need to preserve its use as an identifier. It'd be nearly impossible to get rid of. But it is good to still reduce its use wherever feasible. SSNs are still overused in many cases. A lot of companies, in fact, we had a case study from Aetna in the report we published this summer, where they basically determined internally that having SSN on every page of every medical record and insurance form was a risk, and they're spending, I think, 6 years and $60 million on reducing that. So there's good work that should be done there, but at the end of the day, you still need it for identity resolution. We don't think it makes any sense to try to replace the Social Security number with a new government-issued identifier. And there's been a lot of proposals that are out there, and people get a little excited about them. At the end of the day, we'd spend tens of billions of dollars. We'd create confusion for hundreds of billions of Americans, trying to tell them not to use the old one anymore and use the new one. And it wouldn't really offer much security benefit. In fact, it would just create a new target for people to go after instead. Introduction of a new identifier would require both government and industry to basically map the new one back to the old one. If you think about the data matching errors and the general chaos that would ensue, it's not really a pretty picture. So our take is it might be imperfect, but we're better sticking with the identifier that we know and simply reducing its use than trying to create something new that's not going to be as rosy and shiny as people think. We do think it'd be helpful from the government to actually put policy in place to ban government agencies from using the SSN as an authenticator. They can help lead the way, set an example for the private sector in terms of best practices. We also identified 19 different laws and regulations across 7 different sectors that require the private sector to collect and retain the SSN. Some of them seem to make sense, like opening a bank account. Others tied to, I think, what was one, the wackiest one? Coast Guard boat registry you have to provide your Social Security number to. Maybe it's important, but odds are you could probably reduce the use of it. And finally, we think it's important for government to acknowledge the role that the Social Security Administration plays in the identity ecosystem, since they issue this number to all Americans and they maintain it. For years, when this topic has come up, the answer from both Congress as well as the SSA has been, that's interesting, but that's not the SSA's mission. Their mission is to administer the Social Security program, which gives benefits to people in the country, which is true. But by dodging the fact that they also play a role in the identity ecosystem, it's actually allowed some of the problems we have to get worse. And so one point we've made is we can still argue about what role they should play, but the sooner you acknowledge that they at least do play some role, then we can take a step back and talk about what that means and what role they could play going forward. And we're having some good conversations in that regard. So there's more I could talk about here, but I'm going to stop. And is it questions over happy hour? All right. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jeremy. And everybody, if you would like to move in an orderly fashion to the happy hour in the atrium, which is up at ground level. So if you go up to the lobby level, not the K Street level in the elevators, but the actual lobby level, you will see everything set up. So thank you very much.